Hello everyone, Steven here with Rabbit Hobbies. Now, Silly Putty is a toy that most of us have fond memories of as kids. I remember bouncing it, stretching it, even using it to copy comics from newspapers or magazines. But did you know that Silly Putty is actually a super useful hobby tool? In this video, I'm going to show you how I use Silly Putty when I paint miniatures and why you should too.
What molds into silly animals and silly shapes?
Silly Putty.
What bounces like a ball?
Silly Putty.
What stretches and stretches?
Silly Putty.
What picks up pictures from a newspaper and makes them silly? And if you stretch it, even sillier.
Silly Putty.
Are you sure Silly Putty can do all those things?
Yes, Silly Putty is fun.
Silly Putty comes in a shell shaped like an egg. Nothing else is Silly Putty.
But how do we use Silly Putty, the wonder toy of the 20th century in the miniature painting hobby? Well, we use it for masking. But what do I mean by masking? I mean covering up what you don't want.
Pokehead!
No, not like that. No.
Why would you say something so controversial yet so brave?
Shut up and get to the point!
No, masking like masking tape, covering up the place you don't want to paint so that you can paint what you do, with a rattle can or an airbrush. One thing that's really great about Silly Putty for masking is you have all kinds of free-form shapes that you can make. I mean, Tamiya tape is fantastic if you need to make really sharp lines. Just whatever, masking tape you have is fine. But if you need to make circles, or if you want to make camouflage, this is your way to go. I use Silly Putty masking on all of the miniatures you see here. For these 4 urban mechs from Battletech, I use the Silly Putty to create the camouflage pattern. In this video, I'm going to show you how to do that to do camouflage on your own miniatures. For these minis, I used an airbrush, but I've also used a rattle can in the past. For these other 2 lances of mechs, my 13th Legion of Vega and my Ghost Regiment, I also use Silly Putty masking in tandem with Tamiya tape. Sometimes I want straight lines, and sometimes I want something more organic. You can also get away making some sharp lines with Silly Putty by pulling it fast. That snap that you get, you can actually get a flat edge on that Silly Putty by snapping it. What are some other advantages that Silly Putty has over tape? One other way that it has masking tape beat is it's not disposable. Masking tape is pretty much use it once and throw it away. What about the Silly Putty though? Won't it dry out over time? Actually, no, and it's one of the really cool things about Silly Putty. So I've had this same egg of Silly Putty for going on about 10 years now, and I keep using it over and over again in my masking. This is because Silly Putty is oil-based and not water-based. As you can see, it's getting kind of dark, kind of gross. Sometimes I find hair stuck in it. It's kind of nasty. But I've only been using this one egg of Silly Putty for almost everything.
That's nasty.
Alright, next up we're going to do a bit of a choose your own adventure. Remember those? So I'm a science teacher and I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the science of Silly Putty. If you want to hear about that, stick around. If you want to skip right to the hobby tutorials, the chapters are down below. Just click where it says Hobby Tutorials. So what the heck even is Silly Putty and who came up with this stuff? In 1943, in the middle of World War II, engineers working at General Electric were looking for an alternative to natural rubber because Japan controlled all of that resource. In looking for this recipe for synthetic rubber, chemist James Wright stumbled upon this strange concoction, a stretchy material that withstood decay and bounced 25% higher than rubber. The substance he described as a solid liquid, and he could not figure out a use for it at the time. It was chalked up as kind of a novelty. And then it was turned into a toy.
Hello there.
What a Chad.
I've been all around this wonderful world of ours, and in all of this world, nothing else is Silly Putty.
Except for all this stuff.
What is Silly Putty? Well, it's a real solid liquid. If you pull it so, it'll go forever, like taffy. But if you give it a sharp tug, it'll break like a biscuit. Now, when you make Silly Putty round and drop it, it'll bounce higher than a rubber ball. And here's something else you can do with Silly Putty. Flatten it, press a picture in your newspaper, lift it.
Don't worry, it won't pull paint off your models.
Stretch it this way and that, and you'll get something that's really funny. Always put your Silly Putty back in its egg, or it will run slowly away. You can buy Silly Putty for $1 wherever toys are sold. And remember, nothing else is Silly Putty.
Except for all these. These are all just Silly Putty. You can pay the premium hobby tax to get black putty that just won't look gross when you get paint all over it. You can get a tin of the pretty looking stuff. Or even magnetic putty if you want. At the end of the day, for our hobby purposes, it's all the same stuff. And I found the OG Silly Putty for as cheap as $1.13. Isn't that 13 cents more than the dude said it was in 1957?
You can buy Silly Putty for $1 wherever toys are sold.
Listen to Captain Smoke Ring. Don't pay more for your Silly Putty. What about the chemistry of Silly Putty? How does it do what it does? Let me give you a very brief overview without getting too deep in the weeds here. Silly Putty is a non-Newtonian liquid. Okay, great, but what's a Newtonian liquid? Well, that's the stuff that you generally associate with liquids. Things like water, gasoline, gamer tears when our favorite mech takes a headshot. Non-Newtonian fluids behave differently when forces are applied to them. Some of these are really bizarre, like Silly Putty or Oobleck. Others are much more mundane and familiar to us. Hobby materials like glue and paint, asphalt, even ketchup. Non-Newtonian fluids is basically a catch-all category for any liquid that doesn't behave according to the normal rules. So what makes Silly Putty so weird? Silly Putty's strange behavior comes down to its chemical structure. There are many components to Silly Putty, but the compound that is most important is polydimethylsiloxane, or PDMS. I built a model of PDMS in MoleView, which is a great tool for chemistry students. On the left, you can see the structural formula. PDMS is a silicon polymer, which is basically a chain molecule. On the right, you can see a rough 3D visualization of what this looks like. The silicon atoms are bonded to an oxygen and to 2 or 3 methyl groups. Now, PDMS is viscoelastic. That means it acts like a viscous liquid and flows over long timescales. But in the short term, it's elastic. It can be stretched and bounced. But PDMS on its own does not explain Silly Putty's strange behavior entirely. The other element involved is boron. If you've played Fallout, you probably remember Abraxo cleaner. Well, that's just basically their version of borax, something that we mine for in the US Southwest. Well, boron gets involved with these polymer chains. The boron basically creates cross-links between sections of PDMS. You can think of these as like temporary bridges between the molecules. When force is applied, this causes these bridges to remain stable, which is what gives Silly Putty some of its weird properties. But when it's at rest, the bonds can break and reform and then break again, which is what causes Silly Putty to behave like a liquid sometimes.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
Alright YouTube, I need your guys' feedback. If you watched my sciencey part in the middle of the video, let me know in the comments. Did you enjoy me sprinkling science into the middle of your regularly scheduled hobby content? Did you like the choose your own adventure aspect where someone could just skip their way through? Or should I just make these separate videos? Thank you for your feedback. With that, back to the hobby. These Urbies that you see here were painted up in about 20 minutes apiece. If I were just to try to freehand that using a brush, it would have taken a lot longer. Now using Silly Putty, you can actually create this camouflage pattern using either a rattle can or an airbrush if you have one available. I've used this method on painting tanks and aircraft for Warhammer. This is something that's been used in the scale modeling community for ages, and I know there are those of you that use it as well in the Battletech community. But for those who have never done Silly Putty camouflage, I'm going to show you how it's done. The first step is I usually roll the Silly Putty out into a log, and I section off pieces that I feel are the right size for the model I'm working on. For these little Urbies, it's going to be little tiny pea-sized bits. When doing a larger size thing like a tank for Warhammer, I've used the entire Silly Putty egg before. Here's my Urbie. Now to start with, all I did was spray him with 2 tones of brown from my airbrush. I could have just as easily used a rattle can though for that step. Now I take my little blobs of Silly Putty and just kind of cram them on the model and shape them into the camouflage patterns I'm looking to make. Now you can just use your fingers for this, but I like to use a silicone tool. This doesn't stick to the Silly Putty, but allows me to shape the blobs into whatever shape I'd like. It's also nice for cramming the Silly Putty into crevices, or if I need to make a sharp line between parts. I make sure to use 3 to 5 blobs per miniature, and I do my best to make this a random process. This way each of my 4 Irbies is unique. Alright, here he is ready for the next spray. And I'll be spraying him all over with dark camo green from Monument Hobbies Pro Acryl. But again, a rattle can of a green that you like would do just fine. So I go in here and just paint the whole model with the dark camo green from my airbrush. You don't need any kind of precision for this. A really cheap airbrush would do this just fine. Even one of the kind of lame ones with the built-in compressors. A cheap airbrush is better than no airbrush. Even if it's just for base coating. I found this guy on Amazon for $55, and it's a dual-action airbrush. It can put out 32 psi. At the time of filming, it's got a 20% off coupons, takes it down to 45 bucks. I really recommend for any hobbyist to pick up a really cheap airbrush that you can use for base coating and priming. I'll put a link to this brush in the video description. So an optional step that I did because I had the airbrush available was I added some yellow-green. I used dark yellow-green by Pro Acryl, just to add a bit of a highlight color on top of the green I already sprayed. I did this from about 45 degrees above the model. I made sure not to completely coat the model, but only stick to the raised surfaces and top surfaces of the model for lighting. Now I could stop here, but because I was feeling a little extra, I decided to go up all the way to bright yellow-green. This I made sure to cover even less area, only hitting the very top surfaces of the model, just to give it a little pop. I gave it maybe a little less than 10 minutes to dry, and then it's time just to peel off all the Silly Putty. I don't know why, but this is super satisfying to me.
Yeah, Silly Putty is fun.
Alright, here he is after all the Silly Putty's been pulled off. He's looking pretty good, but he doesn't look as nice as the Irbies I showed you earlier, so what gives? Well, these guys had just a couple other finishing steps. I painted all the metallics in just one metallic color, and I gave them a quick dry brushing in a light beige paint. To finish them off, I painted in the cockpits, and then I gave them an oil wash. And that's really all I did to take the Irbies from looking like this to looking like this. If you want to know how to oil wash, you can look at my Rat Shop videos for Warhammer, it's the same thing. But I'll show you my finishing steps for Battletech on how I panel line with oil washes. That video is coming soon. Now I also use Silly Putty masking on my Legion of Vega models. Let me show you the process. After priming, I sprayed the legs with a warm gray, and then I went in and dry brushed. Started out with that pure warm gray and then moved lighter and lighter in stages. I did the entire lance in one batch. I find it way more efficient to batch paint, and also you can make sure that all of your miniatures have a consistent color scheme. I went from that warm gray to an almost white on the top edges. That way if I want to come back in later and add some more models, I make sure that they fit in with the older ones. I also keep a record of every paint that I use in the process. Once the dry brushing was looking good, I moved on to edge highlights. This was done with that light warm gray all the way up to an almost pure white. I went around and carefully edge highlighted all of the raised edges, just to emphasize all of the shapes on the mech. This really helps them stand out and look great on the tabletop. Now for me, it's not a choice between whether or not I dry brush or edge highlight, it's always both. I use the dry brushing to establish my gradient between the light and shadow, and I use the edge highlights to define the shapes and panels. I feel like this gives me the best compromise between speed and quality. We were having a really dry winter here up in the Pacific Northwest. Found myself from time to time having to add more water to my wet palette. If you're someone who struggles with edge highlighting, here's some things to keep in mind. Make sure that you never overload your brush. You always want a small amount of paint on your brush. The paint that you do have, you want to be damp. If you feel like it's drying up on you, add more water. Most of all, take your time. Get zen with it. Listen to an audiobook or a podcast. This is one of the reasons why I love my airbrush so much. I can skip the base coating stages and I can focus more on the things that matter. Things like freehanding and highlighting. Now I'm new to painting BattleMech cockpits, but I paint them the way that I paint gemstones in Warhammer, and I like to spend my time on that. Find out what gives you joy in the painting process and do the same. Maybe you just want to get your stuff on the table, but you don't want to play with gray minis. Long story short, base coating sucks. Spend your time better. Alright, so I got my Silly Putty out, and I'm ready to prep for my spraying. Using my silicone sculpting tools, I mask over all the work that I just did. I don't want to ruin my paint job when I come into airbrush. So I mold the Silly Putty into small sheets and I wrap that around the miniature. I use my silicone tool to tamp down the edges. I do this for my entire lance. This is going to save all of my hard work from the previous steps and allow me to establish a nice gradient with my airbrush. To base coat the red on my models, I used Mahogany by Pro Acryl. This gave me a nice dark reddish brown to build up from and will also remain as my shadow color. I sprayed the 3 remaining members of my lance. The Wolverine I'd painted in my previous video where I did the random color schemes with the color cubes. Really, the most time-intensive part of this process is just waiting for the previous layer to dry. For this layer I used burnt red, and I made sure to cover about 70% of the model this time, leaving the darker burgundy color in the shadows. The trick to getting a nice gradient while airbrushing is to make sure you leave enough of the previous layer remaining. If you get a bit trigger happy, it's easy to cover it all up. For my last 2 layers, I used a mix of burnt red and bold pyrrole red, and then a finally very careful little blast of bold pyrrole red. I've said it before and I'll say it again, bold pyrrole red is the best red available. If you're looking for a bright, saturated, punchy red, that's your go-to. Now we just wait for that layer to dry and we can peel and reveal. I really enjoy pulling off masking and seeing the crisp lines in between areas. I love how bold and bright this red is against the light gray. It's important to make sure that your layers have completely cured. If you're not careful, you see all the red paint that's on top of the putty, you can accidentally get that on the model. That didn't happen here because I waited for it to dry. Sometimes with Silly Putty masking, you get these like wispy strings of Silly Putty that you have to remove. The trick to that is just use putty to pull it off. The putty sticks to itself and it's the best tool for removing these. So you can see some pretty good progress on my Legion of Vega here. I decided based on community feedback that my lance would be an offshoot of the Legion of Vega. I'm going to go ahead and say the 13th because I've never heard of them. I love that somehow on this channel I can't get away from painting rats. I'm going to go ahead and say it now, each of my battle mechs is being piloted by 2 Skaven in a trench coat. I might even try and put some Skaven logos on these guys. I noticed here was a little overspray where I didn't completely tamp down the putty. That's something that's easily fixable with a brush, which I went in and did afterwards. Overall though, pretty darn clean. In the end, this is how they all turned out. I painted in the orange details, added my metallics, some speed paint black. This is the Wolverine I painted in my previous video. This was done entirely with a brush. I think the catapult is my favorite. I really love how the gradient looks on him. I also really enjoyed painting the canopies. Hey, hold on a second. Thought that looked familiar. So my biggest videos so far are painting Warhammer Skaven. I get into Battletech and randomly create a color scheme, and these dudes' mascot is a rat? And my favorite mech out of this bunch is this guy. It's just too many coincidences. So I also used the Silly Putty masking on this lance of mechs that I painted up for my daughter. The community suggested that these guys would also be from the Draconis Combine. Maybe a remnant of one of the Ghost regiments. This Awesome is my other favorite mech that I've painted thus far. I really enjoyed doing the freehand. Same process as before. Broke out my Silly Putty and broke it up into chunks. I masked up the entire lance's legs. And again taking advantage of my silicone sculpting tool. For the smaller mechs like the Locust, that was very helpful. For the bigger mechs, I just kind of wrapped them in these Silly Putty kilts.
Bless me bagpipes.
Then I only had to worry about precision around their waists. Once they were all masked up and ready to go, I hit them with successive layers of teal blue. I used a triad of turquoise from the Warpaint's Fanatic range on these. So just as before, I started with the darkest layer and then moved my way up to the lightest. I noticed that Warpaint's Fanatic requires more thinning than Pro Acryl. I did the airbrushing on this lance entirely in one session. Obviously sped up the footage and I cut out dead time here, but you guys can see how I mix my paints in my airbrush. Once you have it down, it really is a fast process. Nothing to be afraid of. I was intimidated before I got my first airbrush, but it has truly become my favorite tool in my arsenal. Granted, Silly Putty is up there. Now when I do my airbrushing for most miniatures, I usually go a bit brighter than I want the finished product to be, and that's because I'm going to go in with an oil wash and things are going to darken down a bit. Unless you want to go grim dark, that's a whole other story.
Oh my god! Okay, it's happening! Everybody stay calm! What's the procedure, everyone? What's the procedure? Stay calm! Wait. Everybody...
As I peel and reveal these miniatures, let me know if you found this helpful. Do you have any other uses for Silly Putty that I didn't mention? Coming up on the channel, yes, I will be doing Trench Crusade. No, it will not be the Artillery Lich. I have something different planned. It's going to be gross. I will also be doing a tutorial showing you guys how I finished up these Battletech miniatures. It's going to be part of a full tutorial on how to oil wash for beginners. I will be doing more random Battletech schemes with the color cubes, and some more Warhammer content. I wanted to take a minute to thank all of you who have subscribed to the channel. Thank you so much for your support. If you gave us a like or if you left a comment, thank you as well. I always reply to every comment on my channel. If you have any questions, want any hobby advice or tips, or have an idea about what I should cover next on the channel, leave me a comment.
And remember, nothing else is Silly Putty.